What's your favorite scary movie?
Don't worry if you don't have one, because I'm pretty much an expert in horror. I'm going to take you through the decades of horror from the 70s to the 2020s. And in addition to that, I'm going to tell you the history of them and how they all differ from each other. Because I'm done with people getting them wrong. They are not all the same type. Sorry about that. Let's start with the 70s. The start of modern horror. Where was I? The 70s. The 70s were a new era for horror, with a new way of looking at the genre, primarily how the public views the genre. This was the decade that introduced the world to the slasher genre. Sub-genre. Horror had finally made its way to mainstream media with the outbreak of The Exorcist, directed by William Friedkin. This then went on to star Spark, which would lead to the sudden boom of occult horror, featuring haunted houses and demon possession. The Amityville Horror series, The Omen, Carrie, and quite notably Poltergeist. All of these were about a type of occult possession, and oddly enough, a good portion of these were about possessed children. And quite a few of these are based on books. That took a turn though during the later part of the decade when Halloween ignited the flame to start the slasher craze, which was an interesting vein from decades before. Even decades before, they had done the occult and the unknown, things and subjects people would think of as fake, but the 70s realized it was scarier to be real. Hitchhiking was prevalent all throughout the 60s, even into the 70s somewhat, due to the rise of nomads and hippies. People just didn't have the option of personal transportation or had the money to. Oddly enough, the 70s is when the bans on hitchhiking did start. Movies like The Hills Have Eyes and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre were notorious for perpetrating this notion that hitchhikers were out to get you. I was saying, I'm currently dressed as Laurie Strode from Halloween, who, in my opinion, was the first version of the final girl. Sure, there were others before her, like Sally Hardesty from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I guess the remaining family members of The Hills Have Eyes, but one, the family is a group, so they weren't exactly the final ones. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we'll get into that later. Trope time. A trope is something that happens often in any type of media, whether it be horror, sci-fi, or fantasy even. But horror movies are known for using tropes over and over again. This section's trope, the final girl. A final girl is something that horror movies use mostly in slashers, but has spread through to other parts of the genre. It just means the lost person, usually a girl, usually a girl, that can confront the killer. We'll follow this trope and many others throughout the video, as it's a good representation of changing in the horror game. For now, during this era, here are the rules to being the final girl. Do not drink or do drugs or any sort of substance abuse. And, don't have sex. Please don't have sex. If you have sex, that is almost a surefire way to die in the horror genre. That hands you a one-way street into an axe. Straight in your head, straight in your heart, it doesn't matter, you're dead. The final girl came as almost a progression of femininity in horror, which had been reduced to, as the Chinese term for it is in English, a flower vase, where you could put a flower vase in place of the woman, and that really wouldn't change the plot. Or a damsel in distress, really. The Universal horror series is a good example. of old horror and how they treated women. It's also believed to have come from 60s era New Wave feminism, which progressed feminism way beyond than what anyone could have thought. And it's reflected in the horror genre by showing that a girl, whether it be through strength, outwitting, or just simply running away from the monster, or the slasher, or the killer, they could still kill the killer. Another section we'll be doing throughout this video is Hall of Fame. Hall of Fame is where, you guessed it, we talk about people who belong on the Horror Hall of Fame. We cover notable figures in the industry, and normally the formula is cover an actor, so someone who's in front of the camera, and someone who works behind it, whether that be a director, producer, or a writer, even a cinematographer. Just someone who gave the decade and its horror films a certain spark. Now, I only think it's fair that we honor our first final girl by putting her as the first person in our Hall of Fame. Jamie Lee Curtis, aka Laurie Strode from Halloween. Halloween was actually Jamie Lee Curtis's film debut, and her performance of Laurie Strode took the world by storm, catapulting her into an immediate scream queen. That doesn't mean that she was a stranger to horror. She was the daughter of Janet Leigh, who is known for being in Hitchcock's famous thriller, Psycho. Psycho is obviously a very known horror film, featuring a killer who went after many people. You could almost say it was a precursor to the slasher. You could almost say it was a precursor to the slasher, which meant horror just ran through her veins. Her role in Halloween eventually led her to becoming a scream queen, which is a term that we use to denote actors who are known for being in horror films. Many other Hall of Famers we'll look at after this will be scream queens. After Halloween, she starred in Prom Night, Terror Train, and The Fog, all coming out in 1980, which was only 2 years after Halloween came out. She has continued to play the role of Laurie Strode up until Halloween Ends, which premiered in 2022. Now, onto our Hall of Famer who is behind the camera. And I think it's only fair we make it the director of Halloween, John Carpenter. John Carpenter was known for doing all sorts of horror and sci-fi related films. Halloween was actually one of his earliest movies, being 4 movies into directing. And he's widely associated with the horror genre, not just as a director, but for everything else he did behind the scenes. He did writing, he created the music for many horror movies afterwards. He would go on to collaborate with Jamie Lee Curtis once again in The Fog. He is also known for such projects as The Thing, based on The Thing from Another Planet, Christine, based on a Stephen King horror novel, Prince of Darkness, which is a supernatural horror, and In the Mouth of Madness, which is also a supernatural horror. While he didn't come back to direct another Halloween movie, he came back as the composer for the majority of the remaining Halloween movies. And that would end our exploration of the 70s era. Up next, we have the 80s. 80s section is weird to say the least, but they did carry on something from the predecessor, the Slasher and the Final Girl. But they expanded on it so much more than the groundwork that the 70s provided. This also was the decade where satanic panic started to arise, and vulgarity and sin became such big problems to the public. We covered this in the trope time for Final Girl last section, but here we go again. It spread throughout the media. This became trope time, let's go. Punishment due to sin, mainly lust. Many times during this era, sex equals death. Instant death. You have sex, you die. There is no way out. It came especially poignant in movies that handled infidelity and teenage sex and unmarried sex. In Friday, you see this a lot, especially in franchises like Friday the 13th. This went on to include drugs later on, but not the point. Sex does equal death in nearly all these type of franchises. This was one of the tropes that was heavily influenced by its time. This trope was done during the time of Reagan-era conservatism in the United States, where Christianity's views basically dictated how their entire society worked. Now for our Hall of Fame. This Hall of Famer is extremely influential to the genre for both what he decided to make the movie like and what movies he produced. I could have put him in any of these decades, including and up to the 2010s. Maybe I could even stretch it and say to the 2020s, because that's how big his influence was. This next director is Wes Craven. Wes Craven is responsible for so many of horror's big franchises like A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Hills Have Eyes, Scream, The Last House on the Left. All of which are movies that I have covered or will eventually cover in this video. Wes Craven was extremely influential because of what he did with the horror genre. His breakout movie was The Last House on the Left, which was so gory it was banned and bitten until the 2000s. Wes Craven was a pioneer of the final girl trope with characters like Nancy Thompson from A Nightmare on Elm Street, who I'm trying to dress like, but really these are just my pajamas, and Sidney from Scream. He wrote the screenplays, he directed the movies. Sometimes he made these little cameo appearances in some of them. He tended to base his screenplays and his work on actual events that happened. The Hills Have Eyes was based on the cannibal case. Scream was based on serial killers in general, including people like Ed Gein. And the Nightmare on Elm Street series was based on a series of sleep experiments that were done on Cambodian prisoners of war. Craven also tended to include social commentary in his films, such as how media may be affecting adolescence, as he covers in Scream. And in The Nightmare on Elm Street, you could say that Freddy Krueger, its main villain, was almost a manifestation of how the people of Elm Street reacted to the crimes that he had committed. He is far dead before the series even begins, but the way that it was handled, his crimes, you could almost say it's how a small town tends to react to a tragedy that happens. And so I like to think Wes Craven is an influential director in many genres, you could even say, but including and especially horror. I would put him up there with people like Hitchcock, whose influence still reigns over the genre to this day. So many people know the name of Freddy Krueger and Ghostface, and I think that's a real testament to how his stories have been able to hold up. Scream is an ongoing series. Nightmare on Elm Street has had dozens of sequels, reboots, and so on. And I think that Wes Craven is an extremely powerful influence on the genre, and I think he's actually one of the best horror directors in the entire genre. Now for the 90s. The 90s was a transitional period for horror, to say the least. People were bored of the overdone, oversaturated slashers. They wanted something smarter, something with more effort. Oh, Craven, how we welcomed you back with open arms. Our wonderful 80s Hall of Famer Wes Craven came back, smashing the box office open with Scream, a smart whodunit thriller which invigorated some sense into the genre. Some wow! But not only that, it was a love letter to slashers of past, not putting them down for their repetitiveness, but rather hailing it and using it as groundwork without repeating their problems. You know, the boobs, the over bloody kills, the near supernatural killers. But then a new problem arose with this. People started copying Scream over and over again. This came in the form of more whodunit slashes, and while some were downright trash, some were quite good actually. Like I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend. Both really, really good slashes for its time. Both coming out after Scream. I Know What You Did Last Summer being in 1997 and Urban Legend being in 1998. It was hard trying to pick only a few people for the Hall of Fame. I would go on and on about who the 90s man should produce, but due to budget and definitely time constraints, we'll stick with two. Weirdly enough, it was hard to pick just one Scream queen. Every other decade had a major final girl, one that stuck out, one that was the final girl of the movie that almost dictated that decade. 70s had Jamie Lee Curtis and Sigourney Weaver, but because Curtis was the first proper final girl, I chose her. Heather Langenkamp was obviously Nightmare on Elm Street, which is what I covered in the 80s section. So that was pretty much the Scream queen of that decade, which is just quintessential 80s horror, and the director's amazing. But the 90s just had too many notable faces in front of the screen, too many newcomers. But I have managed to choose. This one actress is such a standout in horror and horror-adjacent projects. I'm not sure why she wasn't the first person to come to mind. Our next Hall of Famer is Sarah Michelle Gellar. In the late 90s, she did her fair share of horror, starting with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, probably her most famous role as a teenage vampire killer. Also in 1997, she starred as Helen Shivers in I Know What You Did Last Summer and Cece Cooper in Scream 2. In the 2000s, she also starred in an English remake of The Grudge. Additionally, while not in the horror genre, but horror adjacent, is both live-action Scooby-Doo as Daphne Blake. Additionally, she got married to Freddie Prinze Jr., who was also a pretty big name in horror. Which brings me to my next person. While not exactly Freddie Prinze Jr., a well-known friend of his and a well-known colleague of his who isn't a behind-the-scenes person. There were many, many behind-the-scenes people that we could have used, but really, like I said, they were from decades past. So I decided to go for both Sarah Michelle Gellar and Freddie Prinze Jr.'s notable co-star, Matthew Lillard, who exemplified 90s horror and the 90s movie scene in general. Lillard's type of acting brought comedy to a genre where, even if it wasn't needed, he was generally appreciated as a break from, well, you know, the horror of horror movies. He was zany, charismatic, and overly physical. He played Stu Macht in Scream, who I've tried to dress up as here, but this is just a sweater, and honestly, I could have been many horror protagonists, because they all love wearing sweaters. Dennis Rathkin in 13 Girls, Shaggy in Scooby-Doo with Sarah Michelle Gellar and Freddie Prinze Jr. And finally, and most recently, and probably the most well-known to current audiences, William Afton in Five Nights at Freddy's. He improvised probably my most favorite line from the Scream series.
You pansy-ass mama's boy!
Fuck! Fucking hit me with the phone, dick!
It's one of the greatest, and he brought a sort of groundedness to 13 Ghosts, which is known for not being the best movie, but I think with the addition of Lillard, it was honestly one of the most entertaining. And he has other sort of projects like Punk LLC, where he starred very well, and not many other projects outside of his horror projects, but he's known for playing D&D, and I can always get behind a good D&D player. And now for my trope time. This isn't a trope. I'm going to be honest, it's not much of a trope. It's more of a type of horror that boomed during this era, and I mentioned it before, the whodunit slasher. Whodunits were the refined version of the genre, the smarter version. One where the killer wasn't a slow-stalking menace or janitor who was burnt to a crisp by an angry PTA. No, these killers were smart. They made sure no one figured out who they were. They were normal people, which circled back to the 70s. If you recall, the 70s based a lot of their horror in reality. With the uprising of serial killers and their media coverage of them sweeping the nation, it's not surprising it happened again. In fact, many horror movies of the 90s were brought into the Columbine case, with lawyers maybe suggesting, and the media suggesting, that they had somehow influenced the two teenage boys to go and kill their classmates. It got so bad that during Scream 3, which was due to come out right after Columbine, if you don't know, a trend within Scream is that there are two killers. Stu and Billy, Billy's mom and Sydney's boyfriend, or something during the second one. And the third one was a solo killer, Roman. This was because the studio was worried that the media would try and bring more bad press to an already declining horror genre. They were scared that had they included two killers, they would have used it in a case. But in Scream 4, they went back to the normal two killers. Scream 5, two killers, and I've not watched Scream 6, so someone will have to tell me about that. But a lot of this was realistic. Friday the 13th, even in 1995, was starting to become a bit more mystical. And it makes me kind of sad talking about this show. Not only are whodunit slashers some of the first slashers that I ever knew, but it kind of pushed the wacky and mysterious and mystical ones out the way. Wishmaster, that came out in 1997, was honestly not a bad concept, but due to the fact that people were more interested in whodunit slashers, it got a low reception. But whodunit slashers are some of the most known slashers. They continued throughout into the 2000s, and a pretty good example of it that was pretty recent is this is more of a whodunit mystery, but Bodies, 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 that came out in 2023, starring Amanda Stenberg and Rachel Sennett and Pete Davidson and Lee Pace, a bunch of people. That was a whodunit slasher almost. A whodunit slasher is normally comprised of a large ensemble cast. Sure, there is a main character, but main character is usually surrounded by a group of friends, much like Jennifer Love Hewitt's character in I Know What You Did Last Summer, and Neve Campbell's character of Sydney in Scream. And usually this killer wears a mask, which is normal. Many serial killers during horror movies wear masks. But the killers are normally quite smart. From a psychological profiling standard, they're pretty ballsy. Because they're constantly leaving clues, like Ghostface constantly leaves phone calls. for Sydney and her friends. The most notable one being from Drew Barrymore's intro that I used in my own intro. What's your favorite scary movie? He uses a voice modulator, or the Hawkman, and I Know What You Did Last Summer, leaves notes that say, I know what you did last summer, referring to the way that the main group of friends had killed a man. They're very smart, and they brought a new breath of air to the genre that was getting old and stale. But you can find out in the next section that by the 2000s, many people were already sick of these slashes. And most of that started in 2004. On to the next section. By the 2000s, everyone was already bored of the horror genre. Every new movie was just a Scream ripoff or a Scream wannabe. So, the American horror film industry decided, if you can't make anything good, just rip it off from someone else. I'm joking, don't actually plagiarize, but this is what 2000s horror in America essentially became, at least in the movie sphere. Many 2000s horror movies in America were just English remakes of already made Asian films like The Grudge, Ring, and Shutter. If they weren't ripping off other horror movies though, they were doing mainly found footage. Found footage is a type of subgenre, mainly for horror, where the film is being presented as if they were non-fiction events. Films like this included The Blair Witch Project, Wreck, which was a Latin American film, and Cloverfield. It became popular mainly due to the Blair Witch Project and how it was advertised. It was advertised as being so real, in fact, that so many people that the actual actors were dead afterwards. Then we go on to 2004, where Saw was directed and released. Showtime, ladies, gents, and in-betweens, not-at-alls, we have, for a lack of a better word, torture porn. I don't really like this genre, even though Final Destination and Saw, both commonly associated with the trope and term torture porn, are two of my favorite movies and movie series. One, I'm gonna stop saying torture porn. And two, once we get past Saw and Final Destination, both pretty surface layer splatter movies, we hit Hostel, which brought splatter into a whole new definition. And while this is not a 2000s movie, it definitely fits into this genre, Cannibal Holocaust. That was a movie made back in the 80s. Torture porn and the splatter genre, if made in the 80s, especially in the UK, would be considered video nasties, like Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, which we talked about just a while ago. These movies tend to include copious amounts of blood and a lot of graphic elements. Character for this section is Daniel Matthews from Saw 2, which is when the Saw series started coming really into its own. Now, for this Hall of Fame, I'm extremely biased towards him due to the fact that he is from the same town as I am. James Wan. James Wan is a Malaysian-born director who is based mainly in America but grew up in Australia. He's known for the horror genre and the action genre. During the 2000s, he created the Saw series, which almost everybody who was connected to the media during the 2000s would know. He also directed Dead Silence, which came out later on in 2007. During the 2010s, went on to do Fast and Furious 7, and also went on to do Aquaman. In the 2020s, he directed *Malignant*. I'm placing him in the 2000s because this was when he debuted as a horror director and as a director as a whole. He's known for being an auteur. You can normally tell when something is of Watts' work when the color grading is either extremely green or extremely blue, with pops of color like red, as he used in *Insidious* to dictate the further, and the use of spirals, which is mainly used in Saw, especially seen on the puppet Billy. He's also got a thing for puppets, as you will learn from *Dead Silence*, *Insidious*, *The Conjuring*, and Saw. And you can't exactly talk about James Wan in the 2000s specifically without talking about someone else, his frequent creative partner Lee Winnell. Lee wrote Saw 1 to 3, and he also wrote the short film version called Saw 0.5, which is available on YouTube to watch. He also helped write *Dead Silence* and 2010's *Insidious*, all of which, not all of which, but majority of which James Wan directed. He frequently acts in these projects in Saw 1 as Adam Stanheight and Specs in the *Insidious* series. He would later go on to be a prolific horror director in his own right, directing a chapter of the *Insidious* series, *The Invisible Man*, and *Upgrade*, all of which are very good movies, but all came out in the 2010s. So we'll stick to the 2000s. James Wan and Lee Winnell are known for collaborating with each other and are known for being very close friends. They've still kept that close bond even though they don't work together as often, but they